Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? Just wanted to do a quick review on subsidies and taxes. We had looked in a previous video at tariffs and price controls. All of these are examples of market failures. For subsidies, couple of things. A subsidy is when the government gives money either to producers or consumers. Consumers can be subsidized. They can have, subsidies for college, subsidies for a vaccine, subsidies for an electric car, right? Subsidies for a variety of reasons. The government can also give producers money, and that becomes an example of a subsidy. Recently in class, we were looking at subsidies that correct for an externality. When that is the case, and it would have to be clear in a problem that you're looking at an externality. If you apply a subsidy to a positive externality and use the subsidy to get closer to or at a socially optimal quantity, in that case, the subsidy is removing deadweight loss from what is already a market failure, the externality. However, sometimes subsidies are applied and it is not due to an externality. It's not for the purpose of correcting an externality. If you have a market that's in equilibrium and you have an allocatively efficient quantity and then a subsidy is placed, you could create deadweight loss. So that's the graph that we'll look at. I've never seen this graph on an AP exam, but useful to have it in your back pocket. And, there's tons of examples of subsidies in everyday life. Maybe, we might look at, agriculture, EVs, the FAFSA, a variety of different things. Here's our graph for the subsidy, okay? And it looks a little bit odd at first, okay? It's not so bad. A lot of this has to do with consumer and producer surplus. So first of all, we're looking at a market graph. We're not looking at a firm. We're looking at supply and demand graph. We have a market supply curve that is described as pre-subsidy. So this is like the original supply curve that the firm is using. We also have a demand curve, okay? So without anything else on this graph, we know we could look at quantity Q1, sorry, that came out so weird, and price P1, right? That's the, equilibrium price and quantity. And we also would know that there would be consumer surplus, okay, without the subsidy. So I know it's not in the right place based on where, the new terms are, but the original consumer surplus would be above P1 under the demand curve, so it'd be a pretty large triangle, and producer surplus would be below price 1 up until quantity Q1, and using the pre-subsidy supply curve. Once you have the subsidy, okay, we have a few things that happen. First of all, let's assume that this is a per unit subsidy, so it's useful to just kind of note there's a difference between per unit subsidy and a lump sum subsidy. Per unit will shift the supply curve and or marginal cost curve if you're looking at a firm. So a subsidy will decrease costs. It decreases ATC. It also decreases marginal cost. So there's a shift, and that might mean a change in quantity in the perfectly competitive, graph. If you have a lump sum subsidy, okay, a lump sum, if this was described as a lump sum subsidy, there would be no shift in supply, okay? This is going to be described as a per unit subsidy. So it is a subsidy that is going to shift supply. We're going to see an increase. Whoops, let me just change my pen. This is our increase in the increase in our supply curve. Okay, and we're looking at an increase something like this. Okay, here's our new supply curve. And as a result of this, we get a new equilibrium. So the most important thing is to note, okay, we've increased our quantity to Q2. We're now operating at this equilibrium, okay, where the market demand and the post-subsidy supply curve are intersecting. And we can start to compare how are producers and consumers doing compared to where they were before at equilibrium with price P1 and quantity Q1. Well, one thing we might note with this subsidy, okay, so the government comes in, delivers a subsidy and lowers the price, right? This subsidy has shifted the supply curve. The new equilibrium has a quantity of Q2, but a price of P2. This is effectively the consumer's price. So the consumer is going to pay this price. Okay. And let's say that the producer gets that price from the consumer. So the producer is also paid P2. And at first look, it doesn't look like the producer is going to be that much better off, but they are, because they're also going to get the subsidy, the per unit subsidy from the government. Okay, this is just the per unit quantity Q2. This would be a dollar amount, right? Between price P3 and P2, that dollar amount would be, kind of what the per unit subsidy is. The producer gets that subsidy from the government, and so their effective price is actually going to be taken as P3. So with a subsidy, it seems like everybody's better off, right? The producer is getting a higher price, the consumer is getting a lower price, and we can kind of see this in addition to the deadweight loss from before, okay? Now we have this kind of additional consumer surplus that gets added because the consumer has a lower price. We can look at this as additional consumer surplus, okay? That red being benefit to the consumer. We also can look at the producer getting additional benefits, okay? Here, because of this subsidy, okay, all the way to here. This is additional consumer and producer surplus. Even though it's flipped and it looks really weird, we're kind of adding that additional benefit to kind of the net benefit that we have. It's kind of additional, consumer and producer surplus. Okay, some of what used to be a consumer surplus is now going to the producer. Some of what used to be, producer surplus is maybe now going to the consumer. So there's a couple things that are different, but the reality is that there is deadweight loss in this, okay? There is inefficiency. The inefficiency is right here because this is inefficient. It is not used because it is not benefit to producer, not benefit to consumer. The subsidies cost is this. So it's like saying this is what the subsidy cost. Some of the subsidy cost is kind of given back in a sense to producers. They get a benefit from this, of this amount, the purple kind of, whatever, trapezoid. Consumers also get a benefit. They get this amount. But there's part of the subsidy that essentially nobody gets, okay? And that is deadweight loss, okay? And in this case, where we're not correcting for an externality, we're not trying to move to quantity Q2, now we are over-allocating the good. We're producing a quantity that's more than what we perhaps desire as a society, okay? So that is the subsidy graph, okay? Let's look at the last thing, which is taxes, something that we spent some time on in class and useful to note. Okay, there's our subsidy. That's great. Quantity up. Okay, everybody wins. Okay. All right. Excise tax is very interesting. Okay. An excise tax is a per unit tax on producers. Okay. There can also be a tax on consumers. We saw that with, an externality. We might have a tax and a negative externality on consumers, a tax on cigarettes, for example, and it shifts the demand curve downward. Okay, that's the idea. A subsidy would increase demand, a tax would decrease demand. For supply, a subsidy increases supply, a tax will decrease it. For every unit, again, not a lump sum, same idea. And the goal would be to make less of a good that might be harmful for us, like cigarettes, okay? Alcohol, tariffs on imported goods are also excise taxes, although, it's a very specific kind of excise tax, okay? Something like that. If you look at a tax, this is going to be very similar to the subsidy graph. In theory, in the steps that you take, it's just going to look a little bit different. If we have a per unit tax on a producer, and let's say it's $2, that means this is our demand schedule on the left. Now we would be kind of looking at a per unit tax at every single quantity. The gap between the two supply curves should be exactly $2, okay? If we wanted to plot this, our prices now would increase to $7, $6, $5, $4, and $3, and you might have a supply curve that looks something like this if we just kind of extended our y-axis and took it up to, $6 and $7, okay? So you've seen a shift leftward as a result of a per unit tax. That's exactly what would happen. You might have to look at the dollar amount of the per unit tax, okay, and you can see it right there. You might also have to answer questions about a tax graph. The price before the tax was $3. That was the equilibrium price. The price that consumers pay after the tax, the supply curve shift in the new equilibrium gives consumers a higher price of $4. So consumers are paying a higher price. They used to pay $3, now they pay $4. The price that producers get after the tax, they reach out their hand, so to speak, and get the $4 from consumers, but then they also pay the federal government a tax. So we kind of travel down at this quantity of 80. They're getting $4 from every single purchase. They are giving the tax to the federal government. So effectively, they are kind of getting, in a sense, less than $4. They're getting $2. And as a result, we can draw in the price for the producers, okay? If we draw in the price of the producers, we can kind of see what the tax revenue will be. We can also get a sense of how much of the tax revenue is being borne by the consumer and what's being borne by the producer. The consumer, who now sees a higher price of $4, used to have consumer surplus that was all the way down to this $3 price. Now consumer surplus is going to be less. The quantity is less, and also the price is higher. So consumer surplus is going to be like, let's kind of imagine it here. Here's your demand curve. This is going to be your consumer surplus. Your producer surplus is going to be somewhere, down here, okay, shaded this area. You are going to have some tax revenue. The tax revenue will be right here, okay. Here's your tax revenue. If I could draw straight, that'd be great. This is the tax revenue. And of course you have some deadweight loss, right? So if you look at the deadweight loss, you might have something, like this, okay, right here. This is going to be your deadweight loss, okay, that triangle right there. You can answer these questions. The total tax revenue for the government before the tax was, of course, sorry about that. Not sure exactly what happened. I think my computer, I don't know, having trouble with my computer lately. So, just to give you an idea of some of the taxes, okay? Let's look at another example. Here's one that's a little bit clearer. What would be the consumer surplus before the tax? That would be A, B, C, D, because the original, the supply curve before the tax and the demand curve intersect to give us quantity Q2. We can see the per unit tax, which would be the same anywhere between those two supply curves, the supply before and after the tax. So the producer surplus before the tax would be H, F, E, and G. So that would be producer surplus. Consumer surplus after the tax is just A, and consumers are paying price P3. Producer surplus after the tax is G, and producers are getting effectively price P1. The tax revenue for the government would be BCHF.